Welcome to the second season of Adapt, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable, so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started.
Hi, Mónica.
Hello, Jessica.
Our guest today is Ben Goldfarb, an environmental journalist who's written two books, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, and Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. I read the book about beavers, I think earlier this year, and became pretty obsessed with it. And I told you that I wanted Ben on our podcast. You were very supportive, of course, as always, but were you a little bit unsure about having a beaver author on our podcast about the built environment?
I was a little bit unsure, even though biodiversity is a topic that really interests me. I couldn't immediately find the relationship between beavers and climate adaptation and resilience. But after speaking with him, I am definitely a beaver believer, and we're not just talking about Justin Bieber. I learned that beavers are nature's engineers, and they have a huge role in mitigating drought and preventing or reducing wildfires. So I'm super excited to share this great conversation with our audience.
Me too. I hope everyone enjoys it as much as we did. Let's get to it. Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. I know a little bit about you because I have read your beaver book and talked to everyone about it. But for our audience, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. So my name is Ben Goldfarb. I'm an environmental journalist, so I write about nature and wildlife and conservation for a variety of different publications, from National Geographic to Smithsonian Magazine to The New Yorker. And I have kind of a background I have a background in various things. I had a brief and inglorious career in ecology, working for entities like the National Park Service and the New York City Parks and Recreation Department, doing urban forestry in the Bronx. I tagged sea turtles in North Carolina. So I had all of these fun nature jobs early in my career. And then over time, I transitioned to writing about those things rather than directly studying them and working on them. And I have a really fun life. I get to travel around and meet interesting people, working with all kinds of cool organisms in the field and write about them. So I get to show up for the fun parts of science, the field work parts, and not have to deal with all of the grant writing and data analysis. I think that's pretty ideal.
That's very cool. And you wrote a book about beavers. We will make sure that we put the link on the notes. What made you decide to write a book specifically about beavers?
I always really liked beavers. I grew up in New York in the Hudson Valley and spent a lot of time as a kid in the Catskills and Adirondacks, canoeing and hiking and fishing. So I was always around them, and I had some baseline appreciation for them. But my full conversion to beaver believer, as the members of the beaver cult sometimes call themselves, that occurred in 2014, in January of 2014. I was living in Seattle at that point, working as an environmental journalist, looking for things to write about. And somebody sent me a flyer for a beaver workshop that was happening in Everett, Washington. And I didn't know what a beaver workshop entailed, but it sounded like it could be a cool story. So I went to this workshop, and it was just one scientist after another getting up to say their piece about why beavers and the ponds and wetlands they create were so important for water storage and salmon habitat creation and wildfire mitigation and water quality. And beavers, I realized that at that little conference, weren't just, these kind of fun, cool, interesting rodents. They were really some of the primary movers and shakers of the natural world, and some of the best natural defenses we had against many of the ecological problems that we're facing. So that it was that day, that conference, that really got me fired up about beavers. And I wrote some articles, and those eventually turned into a book. And here we are a decade later, and I'm still a beaver evangelist.
You have made me a beaver evangelist and a beaver believer. As much as I was a big fan of your book, people might wonder, okay, Jessica, you like the beaver book, but why are you having a beaver author on to talk about beavers when we're a podcast about adapting the built environment to climate change? But as you point out in the book, beavers are basically engineers too, who adapt the natural world all the time to suit their needs. And in fact, as you point out in the book, not only are they adapting the natural world to suit their needs, they also can have a real impact helping us fight climate change.
Yeah.
So, with all of that and other, as Monica and I referenced, it's not just climate change, there's other environmental issues too that impact the built environment all the time. So that's what led me to pick up the book and led me to want to have you on our podcast today. But before we talk about the future and kind of what you think beavers can do to help us going forward, can you tell our readers a little bit about what our country actually looked like thanks to beavers, say 500 years ago?
Sure. I think the first thing to understand about beavers, of course, is how they change the landscape around them, right? And this is something that everybody knows about beavers. They build dams and create ponds, right? And they're doing that to expand their own safety and shelter and security. Out on land, they're vulnerable to being eaten by predators. So by building that dam and creating that pond, they're basically creating this aquatic habitat in which they can be safe from wolves and mountain lions and bears and all kinds of other large carnivores. So they're doing all of this. They're building these dams and creating ponds and wetlands to enhance their own habitat. But in the process, they're profoundly changing the landscape, right? I mean, some of these dams are truly enormous. They can be hundreds of feet long and 10 or more feet high, and they can store many acres of water in the ponds that form behind them. And at one time, those beaver dams and ponds and wetlands were unimaginably abundant across the North American landscape, right? This is an animal that was everywhere. We don't really know how many beavers were in North America at the time of European arrival, but, the best guess is that there were hundreds of millions of beavers, hundreds of millions of beaver ponds. We know from lots of explorers' journals and trappers' diaries and railroad survey reports that our continent was once a much greener and bluer and wetter, lusher place, right? Because beavers were creating all of these ponds and wetlands, storing water, spreading water out across the landscape, irrigating vegetation, creating incredible habitat for all kinds of other creatures, from otters to salmon to waterfowl to amphibians. Beavers were this profound ecological architect, basically wetting North America at a truly massive scale. I mean, there are accounts from explorers crossing what is today Indiana and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had ponded everything up. Trappers crossing places that we think of as desert today in Wyoming and Utah and finding lush marshes full of ducks and geese, right? So we know that beavers were once everywhere and were just incredibly ubiquitous and abundant, and really helped to make this continent green, blue, wet, and wonderful.
And what happened? Can you kind of just take us from there to today? Where are beavers today?
Yeah, we fricking killed them all. We really wiped them out starting in the early 1600s with the industrial fur trade. Colonists arrive in New England and immediately begin killing beavers or trading with native people for beaver pelts to make hats. These sort of fur hats that were made, that were felted out of beaver fur, were all the rage back in Europe. And so the fur trade really begins in the early 1600s in New England and spreads west and south across the continent, with trappers and traders just annihilating beavers in every single river, lake, stream, and pond they encountered. And by the mid 1800s, you would have been hard pressed to find a beaver in the lower 48. We went from several 100 million beavers to perhaps 100,000, all of them, or nearly all of them, up in Canada. You really couldn't have found a beaver in the lower 48 states. And it's kind of hard to overstate. I mean, first, what a profound historic event the fur trade was, right? I mean, practically every significant event prior to the Civil War has some kind of beaver connection, from the Louisiana Purchase to the American Revolution to the War of 1812. So much of early American history was driven by this relentless pursuit of beaver pelts. But in addition to being this major historical event, the fur trade was also this huge ecological event, right? I mean, what happens when you kill a few 100 million beavers? Well, all of those beaver dams break down and all of those ponds and wetlands drain, and you lose all of that water storage. You lose all of that habitat that's so important for trout and ducks and frogs and all kinds of other critters. There are historians who have described the beaver trade as this aquatic dust bowl that dried North America up and caused thousands of miles of stream to erode and lush wetlands to desiccate into dry pasture land. This was really one of the profound changes that European colonists inflicted on the North American landscape before cattle grazing or gold mining or deforestation or agriculture. This was the original sin in a lot of respects.
Wow, this is fascinating. I don't think that the average person knows this. And so I hope that our listeners are definitely learning something today. And it's not just beavers are a good example of how they create natural infrastructure and maintain it, right? Which I don't think we give biodiversity enough credit from that aspect, how dependent we are on biodiversity and how affecting it and damaging it, it's damaging us.
Ben, when you're talking about obviously like the history of European colonization of America, you had a whole bunch of great kind of historical perspective too, right? I'm also a history buff.
Yeah.
You talk about basically that beavers are related to really every significant American geopolitical event between European arrival and the Civil War. And one of my favorite quotes I thought was so interesting was you quoted somebody, James Truslow Adams, who said, "The Bible and beaver were the two mainstays of the young colony. The former saved its morale and the latter paid its bills, and the rodent share was a large one." I just thought that was such a great quote. Again, we all learn about pilgrims and whatever in our history classes, and we all knew about the beaver hat, obviously.
Right.
But I think it wasn't until I read your book that I did understand just how big an influence beavers had on the various European efforts to colonize the US, even of course, like the different competing attempts to do so. But yeah, it really is fascinating. And again, I'll try not to say this too much, but anyone who's interested in American history, in addition to ecology and all of that, should read your book because it really does lay out how tied in beavers are to American history.
Well, thanks for saying that, Jess. And yeah, I mean, certainly that tie extends to agriculture as well, right? I mean, what happens when all of those beaver ponds drain? You're left with these big, broad, fertile, treeless pond bottoms, right? That are incredibly verdant and lush. And in a kind of a rocky, relatively infertile place like New England, those are the best agricultural lands available, right? So there were lots of accounts from farmers and colonists in the 1700s saying, hey, the best place to grow in the quote unquote New World is these beaver valley bottoms, these old beaver pond footprints that are left behind on the landscape. But in that sense, it wasn't just the pelts that made colonization possible by paying the bills, as James Truslow Adams put it. It was actually the way that beavers, followed by beaver trapping, terraformed the landscape for agriculture.
Wow, thank you for that explanation. And moving forward to where we are today, how can beavers be part of the solution to a lot of the problems we have?
Right. So these days, beavers are kind of coming back, right? In the early 1900s, lots of states protected them and reintroduced them. And now we have something like 10 to 15 million beavers in North America. Certainly we're a very far cry from their historic abundance, but this is a species that is not an endangered species and their populations are increasing in many places. And a lot of that is because these days we recognize how useful and valuable they are in tackling so many of our ecological crises, right? And that really begins with water in the American West, because Western states in particular have been very proactive about beaver restoration. Or I don't want to say very proactive because they could be doing a lot more, but it's those Western states that are thinking about the benefits of beavers and restoring them in many places. Here in Colorado, right, where I live, we get most of our water from snowpack, right? It snows in winter, and then that snow sits up in the mountains and gradually melts all spring and summer and fall. And it's that melt water, that keeps water in our rivers and streams and irrigation ditches for agriculture. And that's true in many places in the American West. That snowpack that's our reservoir, right? The problem is that with climate change, of course, it's getting warmer and more of that precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow. And when it falls as rain, it runs off the landscape very quickly, and we basically lose that gradual time release trickle from the snowpack. So as we're losing our snowpack, we need a way of keeping water on the landscape. And hey, wait a second, here's this nifty little rodent that builds thousands of reservoirs for us up in the high country at the headwaters of all of these streams, right? So they're storing lots of water in their ponds. They're also storing lots of water in the ground. As that pond spreads out across the valley, the water soaks into the ground and it recharges aquifers, and it flows very gradually downstream and bubbles back up through the stream bed and contributes to flows that way. There have been studies estimating that there's 5 to 10 times as much groundwater storage around a beaver pond as there is surface water, right? So that water storage helping us adapt to climate change and drought, that's a really big, important ecological benefit of beavers. And then another really big one here in the West is wildfire, right? We know that, again, as the landscape gets hotter and drier, it also becomes more flammable. And of course, fire is this natural, healthy ecological process. But now we're experiencing these gigantic mega fires that are not natural or healthy. That cover hundreds of thousands of acres, and beavers can create these fire refuges and fire breaks on the landscape. Obviously, water doesn't burn, and so by spreading water out, beavers are creating these proof places. During a big fire, all of the critters, all of the birds and mammals and amphibians can retreat to those beaver oases or refuges and survive the fire, and then repopulate the landscape subsequently. Emily Fairfax, a great beaver researcher, has shown that very clearly. So that ability to mitigate drought and wildfire, these two huge environmental problems that are getting exacerbated by climate change in the American West, that's really what makes beavers such a pun unintended, a hot topic these days.
I liked some of your stories of efforts to reintroduce beavers to different places. And in one place, Mónika, I don't think I've told you this, they literally parachuted beavers in with an almost 100% success rate. I think there was one tragic mid-air beaver incident, but otherwise that actually worked, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was in 1948 in Idaho, where they airdropped. They put 76 beavers in crates, strapped the crates to parachutes, threw them out of airplanes. And yeah, as you say, Jess, 75 of those 76 beavers survived. One, unfortunately, fell from the crate midair and fell to his death. Very sad. But the next year, when they flew that landscape, they found ponds and wetlands in all of those places. So that was a really successful initiative at the time. And I should say, too, the Western states get a lot of credit as beaver restorers, but there are plenty of Eastern states that are excited about this stuff as well. In Maryland, there's a lot of beaver reintroduction activity or restoration activity because beaver ponds are really good pollution filtration devices, right? They slow water down, and all of those suspended nitrates and phosphates and herbicides and pesticides have a chance to settle out and improve downstream water quality. In places like England and Scotland, very rainy places, they're reintroducing Eurasian beavers because beavers are really good at flood prevention or flood control. You get a big pulse of stormwater racing downstream, and it hits those beaver ponds and wetlands, and it spreads out laterally onto the floodplain, and it sinks into the ground, and a lot of that flood runoff is actually captured. I think that's kind of a magical thing to contemplate, right? We've got drought in the American West. We have flooding in places like Western Europe and New England. These two polar opposite problems, both exacerbated by climate change. And beavers are helping us address both of them by just stabilizing that hydrograph, slowing down flows, keeping water on the landscape, slow it, spread it, store it, and sink it, as my friend Brock Dolman, a great beaver advocate in California, puts it. So that's kind of the magic of beavers.
All right, I don't know about Mónika, but I have chills, and my goal is to make sure that 100% of our audience comes out of this episode beaver believers.
Beaver pilled.
That's right. So one of the things you talk about in your book too are culverts, which I think we're all familiar. You drive over a road, you see a little culvert running underneath, but you describe them as the Achilles heel of American infrastructure. And again, this is something I've driven by a million of them, never thought about them at all, really. Can you tell us why they're vulnerable and like how that relates to beavers?
Yeah, I'm so glad we're talking about culverts, Jess, because I just feel like they just don't, nobody, as you say, nobody really thinks about them. We drive over them a million times a day and totally ignore them, but they're this huge vulnerability in our infrastructure, right? And culverts, for the uninitiated, those little kind of corrugated metal pipes or concrete box culverts that funnel water under streams. And generally those culverts have been built too small to really handle peak flows, right? They were just kind of put in cheaply many decades ago in most cases. And so what happens is that they're not, as we get these bigger precipitation events because of climate change, they're just not capable of handling all of that runoff. And the water ends up going over the road and the road washes out, or the culverts get plugged with debris. That's very common. And so they're this huge vulnerability. And we see that every time there's a big storm. Thousands of culverts failed during Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy or during Hurricane Irene, right? This is this huge vulnerability in our infrastructure every time there's any kind of natural disaster. And beavers are another thing that make culverts vulnerable, right? If you're a beaver swimming along looking for a place to build your dam, well, the roadbed is like the world's greatest dam. And the culvert, that little pipe, is the leak in the dam. And beavers plug leaks. That's what they do, right? And so they plug up that dam with sticks. The water rises, the road washes out. It's this big, time-consuming kind of headache to maintain that also creates a human safety risk. And traditionally, the way that we've handled those beaver conflicts is by killing the beavers, right? We kill many tens of thousands of beavers for causing conflict with infrastructure in this country every year. And one of the arguments of my book is that we should really be handling those conflicts in a different way, in a non-lethal way. We have lots of techniques for solving those culvert conflicts and other beaver conflicts without resorting to killing the beaver. We can fence off those culverts so they can't plug them up. We can build contraptions that are commonly called flow devices. Sometimes you hear them called beaver deceivers, which are basically these pipe and fence systems that allow water to keep flowing through those culverts without having to trap the animals themselves. But yes, beavers they can cause some conflicts, and culverts are one of the conflict points on the landscape. But ultimately, we know that these animals are worth so much more alive to us than they are dead, that their ecological benefits and contributions far outweigh the relatively minor infrastructural costs they can incur. And it's really incumbent upon us, I think, to find ways of living with these animals rather than killing them every time they come into conflict with us.
And even though it appears to the common eye that beavers are on our way, we were on the way of beavers and many other animals before. I try to remind myself of that when I see deer crossing the road. That's their way. We just interrupted it with the road.
Beavers commonly get called a nuisance species. I mean, we are the nuisance species much more than they are. They were here first, and I think part of being a good citizen of the land and a neighbor to wildlife is finding ways to live with them.
Yeah, absolutely. You alluded to the value of beavers thriving in nature. An organization that we are big fans of, it's called the National Institute of Building Sciences, has shown the financial benefits of incorporated climate resilience, so like the ROI, the return on investment from resilience. Your book mentions a 2011 report that finds a similar financial benefit to restoring beavers, which I think may be what you were alluding to. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that was a report performed by a kind of an economic consulting firm whose name I'm forgetting right now, but I can find the link and you can put it in the show notes or something. But basically, it was this report that looked at the benefits of restoring beavers to one single watershed in Utah, the Escalante River drainage. And they basically found that beavers would be worth tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in that single watershed. And again, that's thanks to their water provision benefits, right? Keeping water on the landscape. They're creating great habitat for the trout we like to catch and the waterfowl that some people like to hunt. So there's this kind of hunting and fishing, recreational benefit there. There's that water quality benefit that we were talking about earlier, where they're filtering out pollution. They're restoring all of these degraded streams. So they're just providing these incredible ecological benefits and services to us. And again, that's a single watershed in Utah. I mean, you extrapolate out and think about, what the environmental or economic benefits of restoring beavers to the entirety of North America would be. I mean, certainly in the many billions of dollars. So this is an immensely valuable animal. And of course, the value of an animal isn't the sole measure of its worth, right? I'd argue that even if beavers weren't worth a dime, they have a right to be out there, and they create landscapes that I consider incredibly beautiful and soul restoring and life-giving for all kinds of other creatures. I think there's just a powerful argument that they have as much a right to be on the landscape as we do, regardless of their economic benefits. But I do think that being able to say to State Fish and Wildlife Agency or a county commission, hey, these are really valuable, beneficial animals. There's a strong economic argument for not killing them. I do think that's a really powerful argument to be able to make to policymakers.
Even though I would like to believe that, we don't care about the financial benefits of whatever investment. Unfortunately, that's how the world works these days. So studies like that are very valuable. So we'll make sure to put the link to that study on the notes.
Yeah, I mean, going back to being a beaver believer, obviously your book convinced me. And it is interesting because Mónika and I, again, we're focused on adapting the built environment. The first tendency is to think about concrete, steel, wood, right? Like the things that you actually see that build something. But more and more, there's talk about green and blue infrastructure, right? And the green and blue adaptation. In other words, like you said, using wetlands or like beaver created dams to help with wildfire breaks or wildfire oases, flood control in the Northeast, like you said, and in Europe. You also talk a lot in your book about how farmers who traditionally have not liked beavers are starting to realize more and more the benefits of beavers to help them with irrigation, especially out west as water becomes more and more precious. Are you seeing more from communities realizing that beavers could be part of their kind of adaptation to climate change plans?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly if you read the U.S. Forest Service's climate adaptation plan, or at least the section in a national plan that deals with our national forests, beavers are mentioned in there, right? So you do see them increasingly popping up in the language around climate adaptation and mitigation. And I think you do see a lot of action on the private landowner front as well. You mentioned ranchers. One of the stories I tell in the book is about this guy, Jay Wild, who's in Idaho, and Jay lives on this homestead. He's got a ranch, and he grazes his cows up on public land. And as a kid, the stream that fed his homestead had water in it basically year round, and that at some point that stream went dry. And years back, he was kind of thinking, okay, what happened there? Why is that stream dry today when it used to be perennial? And he realized that, oh yeah, it used to have beavers on it, right? And what do beavers do? They build dams and they slow down water so that instead of running off the landscape right away, that water gradually trickles out of those ponds and stays in the stream year round. Jay reintroduced beavers to that stream. He partnered with some guys at Utah State University to build a bunch of human-built beaver dams, basically beaver mimicry structures to give the beavers a leg up. And now he's got more than 200 beaver dams on that little drainage, and he has close to 2 months more water in summer, right? So again, as beavers slow that water down, they just make sure that there's still water in the stream come July, August, September, the kind of the hot, dry seasons. There's a guy, kind of the prototypical rancher. He's got his cowboy hat and his tin of dip in his pocket, and he's really embraced these animals to an amazing extent. And he's become this sort of beaver preacher himself, who goes to other communities and tells other ranchers about the benefits of beaver. Certainly, we're not seeing complete uptake of the beaver solution everywhere in the United States. We're still killing way too many of these animals, unfortunately, and not coexisting with them nearly as well as we should be. But you do see these wonderful, exciting little pockets of change.
That's fascinating. Talk about value, right? From beaver restoration and protection.
Yeah.
I am, to an earlier comment, Jessica, I am slowly falling in love with beavers too.
So right. Welcome to the cult.
Yay!
Last year, you published another book called Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And we'll also put a link to that. We discussed in a recent episode, the role of streets in communities, both negative and positive. Can you tell us a little bit about that book called Crossings?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, Monica, it really resonates with something that you said earlier, right? Which is that when we're driving down a highway and a deer crosses the highway in front of us, we have this default sort of reaction like, hey, what's that deer doing there? When in reality, obviously, that ecosystem and that forest and the wildlife that inhabit it, they were there first. And we have superimposed millions of miles of roadway on our planet's ecosystems. And crossings is really about the immense ecological cost of doing that, of having built out this massive spider web of concrete and asphalt. And that book is really about everything from roadkill, of course, the most conspicuous interaction between traffic and animals, to the impacts of road noise pollution on both humans. We know that noise pollution is this huge public health problem that's raising our rates of diabetes and cardiac disease and stroke and all kinds of other public health maladies. And it's also a huge ecological problem that's chasing animals away from places they'd otherwise like to live. Animals live in this very sensitive acoustic world, and they're very sensitive to road noise. Road salt is part of the problem, right? We add 20 million tons of road salt as a de-icing agent to our highways every year, and that runs off into our rivers and lakes and streams and makes them saltier, much to the detriment of a lot of the aquatic life that inhabits those systems. So crossings is really about all of those different connections between roads and nature, most of them negative for nature, and what we do about them, right? How do we start to solve some of the problems that our highway infrastructure creates for wildlife? And that's everything from wildlife crossing structures, bridges and tunnels that allow animals to safely move back and forth across highways and complete their migrations, to road decommissioning. In many places, roads are actively being removed for the sake of nature, especially in our national forests. What do we do about the problems that roads create for wildlife, and how do we start to solve some of them? That's really what that book's about. And I think because your listeners are obviously interested in the built environment and how it intersects with the natural world, I think that your listenership would really enjoy that book.
It's on my list to read. And I mean, basically, I'm now going to read all of your materials. So I know we talked a little bit before. We talked a little bit before we started recording. And so now you can tell the audience about what you're working on right now, which is also another really exciting project.
Yeah, right now I'm writing a book about fish and I'm still working on the elevator pitch because this is very much, in its early stages. But I think that the book is really about fish movement and migration as this driving ecological force that shapes our planet in various ways, and all of the ways in which we've compromised fish populations through mega dams and culverts. I can't escape culverts, and of course overfishing and all of the other anthropogenic factors that have really harmed fish populations. And it's about the places in which fish migrations and movements and populations are being revived and restored. Like we were talking about the Klamath River earlier, Jess, where 4 giant dams have just been removed for the sake of salmon migrations. And just in the last week or so, biologists have seen salmon already migrating past where those old dams were to spawn, complete their life cycle, which is, of course, incredibly exciting. So that's what the book's about. All of the just fish as this kind of planetary life force that shapes our world and our own civilizations in various ways. All of the ways in which we've jeopardized fish and all of the ways in which we're trying to restore and revive them. Look for that book in like 2048 or something.
We'll definitely follow you. The topic sounds super interesting. Back to beavers, and before we close,
that's where all conversations should end, Monica, is with beavers. So we have to come full circle.
Listen, I see the relationship between the built environment, the construction industry, which I'm in, and beavers. We're essentially doing the same, right? We're building, we're constructing, and we're maintaining, right? And that's what beavers do. So we want to leave our listeners with some action items. I'm sure we're not the only one falling in love with beavers. So if we wanted to do something about the protection, the restoration, and just learning more about beavers, can you point us somewhere? Are there organizations doing a really good job that we can support, perhaps?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's an organization called the Beaver Institute, which has all kinds of resources, both about the benefits of beavers and, I think really importantly, how to, again, solve those conflict that beavers can create, or that we create, but that beavers are involved in. So for example, if you're a landowner and beavers are cutting down some beautiful old apple trees that you want to protect, okay, here is the proper way to fence off those trees so that beavers don't cut them down. So we don't have to kill the beavers. We can just let them be. If beavers are clogging one of those road culverts or flooding your backyard, okay, here's how we can install one of those flow devices, one of those pipe and fence systems that lowers that flooding level and allows humans and rodents to coexist. So check out the Beaver Institute, definitely, if you have any questions about why these animals are good and how we can keep them around. And then I'd also encourage you to talk to your local government as well. I mean, I think that one of the great things about beavers as a kind of an action item is that their fate is really controlled locally, right? This is not some endangered species that's managed by the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a species whose future is going to be determined by county commissions and town councils, all of the local government entities that manage roads and bridges in your community. And we were talking about culverts earlier, right? And when so many of the beavers that are killed, the tens of thousands of beavers that are killed for plugging up road culverts, right? In the county that I live in, the county historically had kind of this informal $50 bounty on beavers, where any member of the county road and bridge department who killed a beaver in a culvert got $50 from a pool, basically, is my understanding. But there are so many cool case studies, many of them I describe in the book, of concerned community members going to their local government, to their town council, and saying, hey, let's figure out a different way of dealing with these conflicts. Let's protect these beavers, install one of those flow devices, and basically solve the problem that beavers are causing without having to resort to killing these animals. So I'd encourage you to talk to your local government and basically say, hey, what do we do about beavers in our culverts? How are we managing those conflicts right now? And is there an opportunity to do it better and smarter?
I want to thank you so much for coming on today. This has been so exciting to get to talk to you. I really hope that we have converted everyone to become a beaver believer. Really, when we think about climate change, there are so many problems, but so many of them do come back to too much water or too little water.
Yeah.
We also then have the too much pollution in our water as well, and wildfires. I mean, those really are some of the biggest threats that we face, aside maybe from hurricanes. But beavers are so central to helping us address all of those problems that we just across the nation, across the globe, because as you pointed out, other continents have their form of beaver too. We really need to be enlisting these brilliant ecological engineers to help us out. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We are very excited about all of your future writings. I cannot wait now for the fish book to come out. So I'll be emailing you once in a while. Ben, are you almost done? I want to read that book. Thank you so much for everything today.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Jess and Monica. I really, really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.